Compared to some of the cities that you've looked at overseas, what are your reflections about the state of governance of Australian cities?
Well, I think specifically in relation to questions about spatial change and growth, if you look at the European countries, West European countries, over the last 20 years, almost all of them have had some kind of neighbourhood renewal programme as a kind of third dimension, if you like, of overall anti-poverty programmes. There have been tax programmes, benefit programmes, but the neighbourhood renewal programmes have been where change has been integrated and government has joined up. You don't join up government in the abstract, you have to join it up somewhere. And very often it was at a neighbourhood scale that at least the social programmes joined, and you had to think about the metro scale. And I think that these have generally been effective. But in the Australian case, you didn't have any national programmes. And actually within within states, you didn't have any particularly significant neighbourhood programmes. In Canada, if I may switch continents a moment, there was no, after the really middle of the 1990s, there were no neighbourhood programmes either. And neighbourhood renewal is something that's left to either municipalities or provinces to pick up. And similarly, the metro programmes, there was no urban policy in Canada after about 1985. And in Australia, after Better Cities, essentially there was no urban policy. What you see the difference, say, between Canada and Australia is the level of government that stepped up to the plate was the state governments. I think the state governments in Australia can be reasonably proud of their record in thinking about big picture change for their metropolitan areas, and as I said earlier, particularly the city cores. I mean, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide in different ways, and Perth have all been phenomenally successful. And I think the fact that the geography that within each of the Australian states you have a state capital that has been the focus of state action has been really important in guiding resources and structures in a context where there was no national urban policy and no neighbourhood policy. And what I thought was good in Victoria, for instance, is at the level of metropolitan planning. And thinking about that was, I think, quite effective. But what was really missing was anything below that. And I think that the reason for that was metro planning is about harnessing and focusing growth, whereas dealing with problems at neighbourhood scales requires integration of government and expenditure. You were much happier about controlling people than spending money. And I think that in consequence of that, the governance arrangements across the Australian states for urban change have been good at the top level and poor at the more decentralised level. Going back to Melbourne 2030, great framework in many ways, but no instruments or institutions to actually make change take place other than where growth could be captured. Absolutely nothing in terms of delivery agents for change in transit cities or indeed in priority areas. And that's what was really missing to me in the Australian dimension, and is missing in most Canadian cities, because at present, at least your federal government and your state government are engaged in these issues. If you're in Ontario, it's really hard. And that's one of the reasons why Melbourne's a much better city in terms of progress and change than Toronto is, because there is a coherent government vision, at least at one level in the system.
So, looking around the world, what models of governance appear more likely to lead to successful cities?
Well, I think that, if we go through, I think national levels of government have to appreciate that the economy and the society doesn't exist in the head of a pin, but that you have to be aware that where things are happening has a significant implication for the overall well-being of the economy as well as its internal connectivity. So that I think it's really good that, as I say now, you hear the Secretary of your Treasury, the head of the Treasury, saying growth's an issue, we have to think about our cities. We've seen Infrastructure Australia make some noises in the general direction of strategic infrastructure investments to support change that are at least consistent with some degree of spatial thinking. That's good. But I would like to see, and it still has to be demonstrated, because although I think progress in housing policy has been spectacular in Australia since the Rudd government were elected, in terms of the number of things that are actually happening and housing even being built as a result of these initiatives, to do that within 2 years is really impressive. We often take about 4, but we have longer periods of government, or we had at least. But on the cities agenda, it's been much slower, and I do hope that the cities agenda does firm up into a framework at the federal level that develops expertise, that understands issues across different places, and creates incentives, create new institutions and organisations, but doesn't dead hand what actually happens down at lower orders of government. In other words, I think the state level is still a really important level in terms of delivery and combination of these things. But a facilitative federal approach, a state approach that actually really gets to grips with the problems and recognises it has to create the institutions and vehicles that are appropriate to the policy problems you face now, not to the delivery of welfare services in the 1950s and 60s, which I think is a bit of a backsliding that occurs in thinking about governance and government. And round about governance, of course, as suggested earlier, it's really important to look at partnerships. It's really important to look at the role and importance and significance of community and local delivery vehicles. And I don't think that we're quite there yet.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you found in Auckland, about in sort of going back, what the triggers were for the Royal Commission into the governance of Auckland, and how it's gone since then, how the transition's going?
I think that the government of New Zealand were very concerned that Auckland was falling behind in some senses and losing a lot of talented people, not least to Australia, whilst they were also dealing with significant inflows of new talent, but a much more diverse group in terms of skills. So they're interested clearly in how this metropolitan area works. They'd begun to recognise, of course, that the spatial growth of Auckland had gone beyond the boundaries of not just individual local authorities, but the regional council. And there was a recognition that somehow it wasn't quite getting metropolitan planning right, but also was not managing to engage at a more local level with communities, and indeed local government wasn't quite managing to make it in terms of the sorts of things they expected to happen. Yet there were really, by the time the Commission was actually up and running, of course there was a change of government, and a lot of these issues revolved around about planning, where initially the government in New Zealand were hostile to the notion of planning, and were actually very concerned about the issues about land use boundaries, and had actually seen them as the cause of significant house price inflation. I may say without any really solid evidence for doing so, but that's what usually happens in these debates. At the same time, the Metropolitan Authority wanted, I think they were sensing their own demise, wanted to make, I think, a kind of milestone statement, which was about being tougher on issues about the environment, not really getting to grips with the economic consequences of the land use zoning, etc. they were dealing with. So in the context of Auckland, where you're talking about 40% almost of the output of New Zealand, it wasn't a very efficient platform for economic development, and at the same time was not being supported by government to transform in the most effective ways. And I think the Royal Commission actually allowed both parties to begin a new conversation, which actually I think is going quite well, given they come from very different positions on some of these issues.
When you say parties, do you mean the political parties or the levels of governance in Auckland?
Inter alia, all of these things. Yeah. I was using the words parties in a generally non-fun sense.
Right, small people.
Central and local government, left and right, economic planning, all the different parties that I think at least are involved in a constructive discussion, which is actually raising the question, well, okay, if we're doing all of this for Auckland, maybe we also ought to have a view about what our other major cities actually contribute to the economy. So there's a kind of interesting knockback, and we'll see how that pans out in New Zealand, because I think that whilst ministers don't seem to be particularly engaged in some of these issues, the Prime Minister does seem to be, and has a fairly, I won't say technocratic view of the world, clearly not just technocratic, but is very capable of understanding the issues of the importance of Auckland to the economy and these outcomes. As indeed in Melbourne, the significance of the kinds of issues I was talking about earlier to the economic outcomes for this state are really significant. I listened to the Premier at the National Housing Conference last week, and he was very impressive. But he talked about housing policy simply as helping social cohesion. He didn't talk about how it impacts the housing sector outcomes, impact the progress of the economy in the longer term. And I think that these are the kind of things that your state treasury, as well as the national treasury, have to begin to make progress on. In classical models of economic development, we could talk about Adam Smith if we really wanted to talk about Scots of value, then, or at least interested in value. We had labour and we had capital, but we had land. And what I'm saying is, in terms of governance and thinking and policy, in a broad generic sense, has not paid enough attention to land.
So just before we take it to the floor, I just want to ask the last quick question. We should do it quite quickly. How useful do you think it is to consider models of governance from elsewhere in the Australian context? And what doesn't translate to Australian social and political circumstances?
Well, I actually think in international work, it's really important to recognise you never really bring solutions. You actually bring questions, or you can illustrate questions that people have, that the solutions have to be worked out in specific contexts. But you can learn. I'll give you a couple of examples of these kind of learnings and why it's important. In the 1960s, Australian states very intelligently invented corporations that could get involved in land renewal, like Vic Urban. After the 1960s, they grew and some of them prospered. In the UK, we didn't have anything like that, but we had big urban policies, we had big housing policies. And we'd be going into areas through the housing corporation, putting in big grants to help fund housing association development in areas where there were rising values, in areas where there was brownfield land. We weren't capturing much of the gains from that process. Well, in England, they set up English partnerships, and its first chief executive was from, I'm sorry to say it's New South Wales, who actually applied everything he'd learned about that model in the English context. It was enormously successful. We were desperately jealous of it in Scotland, at least I was, but we never quite implemented it. Now in the UK, they've merged that body, English partnerships, with the housing corporations to bring land and housing development money and government money for that together in a very obvious way to actually reduce the bureaucracy of creating change, both in growth management and regeneration. So we learned a big lesson from you, but of course you don't do it in discussions like this. This forms the basis for further questions for you to answer, but I think that was one example. On the other hand, people can be really defensive about this. When we talk about issues I was talking about the suburbs and the environmental consequences of that, people will say to me, you don't understand. 90% of Australians want to be homeowners. It's their aspiration. You don't understand that. Well, that's bloody great, I say, because if you do surveys in Glasgow, it shows that 90% of people want to be homeowners, right? So the aspiration's not different. You then get told, everyone wants a quarter-acre block. Absolutely, good on you. We all like land too. In Canada, the more land I get, the better. I like it. It's positive. It's valuable. But why? I also like really good Shiraz, and now that I've passed my driving test recently, I'd like a really comfortable car. Now, no politician's going to say, well, here, everyone wants Shiraz or whatever, nor do they necessarily need anything other than very basic, means of transportation. So why this obsession in the politics of Australia about home ownership rates and the quarter acre development? I think that you can, well, you're all entitled to your own obsessions. But in this case, where I think political responsibility is not having a fight about boundaries, about green belts or Melbourne 2030. That to me is a dead question. What really matters is the fact that energy costs, we saw signs of it last year and the year before, significant spike. When I was working in the government of Canada, our assumption was that's the start of a long-term process. And that we were interested in this in Canada because we're major oil exporters with a huge carbon footprint. But we would see that within 10 years, you can expect energy prices to be a third more expensive, at least, than they are now. Now, why does this matter? You've just had an announcement today that Australia, hooray, builds the biggest houses in the world. Bloody good when you have to cool them down. Are you going to use fans? You know, when and they won't be designed in traditional style to reduce some of these heating and cooling consequences. They're also further and further away from city centres. Now, what I want to know is, even if I wasn't interested in carbon footprints and altruistic views about children and grandchildren and the environment they lived in, if I was just interested in the choices that the average Melburnian will face in 10, 15 years' time, by building the structures that we're building now, we're actually giving people really poor choices for the future. So that in terms of what transfers, well, I think the ability to challenge cultural biases is useful because it might point out some of the long-term consequences of sticking to it. And in our case, we've become embedded in the UK with this home ownership rate issue, and it's costing us dear in terms of instability in the housing market because we keep getting people into home ownership who can't afford it and then fall out at great cost, you know, further down the line. And similarly, I think in this context about energy costs and land, I think Australians are pretty realistic as people. They've always had to be, and it's time they were actually realistic about what these choices mean, not on greenhouse gases, but in terms of their budgets 10, 15 years from now.
My name's Zach Kerr from Freehills. You spoke a little bit about the importance of infrastructure renewal and investment in cities working efficiently, etc., and also of the need to have an open dialogue between different agencies and engagement with community in having that development happen. We've found a little bit here that sometimes those dialogues can end up in planning disputes and things being delayed and difficulties happening there. What's your experience in other cities in how some of that's been navigated more efficiently than what we've done?
I think that, well, the Victorian planning system was an area of grief, personal grief, that I didn't necessarily intend to get into, but I think that once you have a regulatory process, and I do think you do have to have a planning process. I wasn't wanting to seem in any way anti-planning, although I was critical of the way plans were used. Once you have a planning process, I think that it is important to cut out all the issues about unnecessary red tape, although the gains in productivity from that are always tiny, although ministers and finance ministers always emphasise them. Getting a good process whereby people are involved in a development process whereby they can simplify that. And I know Victoria is trying to move to a kind of one-stop shop so that you deal with all the different state departments. I think that's useful, and not all states and provinces elsewhere would do that. I think then actually making sure it's appropriately staffed to give people reasonably fast decisions is also important. You will always end up in disputes because these are contentious issues. But I think that NIMBYism, if that's a question, if politics is neutral on these issues or does not get over to the public the real importance and real significance of these issues, then it actually gives fuel to people to in a sense come back and make these kind of delays in processes. And I think that at the end of the day, you have to use occasionally judicious compulsory powers to actually deal with some of them.
Sorry, my name is Donald Bates from Lab Architecture Studio. The question is, you spoke about the negative effects of expanding cities and the relationship between the sort of city cores, the vibrancy of the city cores versus the peripheries. I'm wondering if you have any examples of cities that have enforced a sort of city wall, that is to say, have enforced the non-spread of the city, and if so, has that tactic been successful anywhere, or is it inevitable that every city worldwide is a never-ending expansion?
I think that since the general removal of city walls and gates, it's been impossible to kind of keep people in. I think that some people, and I'm not saying that you take this, but some people take the ideas about densification or about compact city as somehow bringing everyone back in. It's too late for that. I mean, the horses have generally bolted to the suburbs. And that, in a sense, what we have to do is a couple of things. The first is to make sure that when suburban development is taking place, that there's a variety of land use and facility, that there's social infrastructure. My point earlier about Canadian cities and children and obesity is simply because in places like Calgary, we've gone to developing single tenure, single land use suburbs that have no social infrastructure in them. So everyone has to travel to everything. If we think differently about that in terms of the anatomy of the suburb, if you like, but also the physiology of connections to labour markets and other places and transport systems round about, we can do a lot to make things better. I did notice that when the Victorian government were rethinking Melbourne 2030, or appeared to be rethinking Melbourne 2030 at the end of last year, they were also putting in a big bid to Infrastructure Australia to have at least significant transport that seemed to me to be about half public transport to deal with some of these issues. That's an improvement on how things, I think, were in the past. The other important thing to do is to use, I think, sites within cities as effectively as possible. Under the Labour government in the UK, there was, when Prescott was the Deputy Prime Minister, he just decreed that 80% of new construction had to be in brownfield sites. And that was inherently, towards cities or towards existing locations of development, and actually led to some quite high quality density development, so much so that people who'd been opposed to the notion, even although we're more habituated. I live next to the new town in Edinburgh, which is extremely high quality and extremely high density. He habituated people to the notion that you could do this and also do a bit of tenure mixing. So that kind of recognised that sites are there and you need to use them. Here, of course, it becomes a discussion about what do you do about infill. And infill ends up not being as big a part of the effective land supply as certainly planners would like. I actually think that a lot of infill development should be, instead of NIMBYism, actually encouraging the residents and communities that are there to think about how they do the infill or move to the infill. If we do move to higher fuel costs, we're also in an era of more affordable, more expensive housing. We're also in a context where, with ageing, my generation, which have had a pretty good deal out of life, now have two interesting issues to deal with. Our parents are threatening to come and live with us at the same time as our children are coming back from university. I've managed to escape this, but only just. Now, in that particular context, there's new patterns of living that are going to emerge. We are actually going to, because housing is such an important wealth asset, not just for individuals, but for families, we are going to see new, and old age is going to be a bigger issue for all of us in paying the costs of it. We're going to see slightly different approaches to issues about housing. Now, how people use infill sites, how you, in a sense, rethink the connections within families and within the tissue of the existing metropolitan area, actually creates slightly different opportunities, and you don't necessarily expect genetic oppositionalists to dominate discussions about infill forever. So I think that we can get to some better outcomes.
Craig Pearson, Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. Pretty short question, just asking for one answer. I would suggest to you that on our current trajectory, our cities will become increasingly non-sustainable in terms of energy, economics, social capital, whatever. My request for a short answer is, if you had the power or the persuasion to do one thing to get us off this trajectory, what do you think is the most important?
I'd tax fuel.
Thank you.
Yeah, Gabrielle Kuiper from Vic Urban.
Thanks.
You talked a lot about the importance of place in our approach to policy making, or perhaps taking a more spatial approach. And I guess it's two parts to the question. One, how much do you think our economistic thinking is responsible for the ignorance about place in policy making? And then the obvious corollary to that is, how do we change that, given that economic thinking seems to still, that's not spatial economic thinking, but straight economistic thinking seems to be dominating our policy making, continue to dominate our policy making?
Well, I think Treasury thinking is often mystic rather than economistic, but I think the conventional wisdom in a lot of not so much economic development ministries, because they're much better at understanding real development, but I think treasuries have traditionally had a very abstract reductionist view of how real economies actually operate, and they're very concerned with big totals and modelling and so on. But I think that economists have always been interested in questions of place and space. I mean, I mentioned Marshall. You can find instances of discussions of urban context, growth context in Adam Smith or whatever. So that place is really important. And it's not just this questions about the frictions of transport costs, but the way in which spillovers occur, the way in which markets fracture information and market failures. And I think that, well, recently, of course, the most recent Nobel Prize in economics went to Paul Krugman, not for his writing in the New York Times, although it's exciting, but for his contribution to spatial economics. So I think that may be changing, and I think that economics is actually a much better discipline in dealing with some applied questions now than it was. But Treasury ministries are holding on, I think, much too ruggedly to the kind of synthesis that they picked up under neoliberal administrations. And I think you do have to keep working at this, but what you'd have to do coming from outside the Treasury is make clear that you can articulate the economic consequences of the policies you're going to implement. And in my particular area of interest is in housing policy. Housing policymakers never do that, other than tell you the number of jobs that will be created. It doesn't tell you about how it creates this new platform, how it influences assets, how it influences saving, how it influences mobility. We don't do that. We appeal on the basis of the social need. Or people in Vic Urban, I don't know, maybe you appeal on the basis of design and quality of place. Well, you've got to get over that and actually get to articulate the economic benefits of what you do. So it works both ways. I don't mean to be rude, but it works both ways.